In history, there are many facts that historians contest on. New information is discovered every day, and what was once a fact can easily change. Even in the world around us, there is still questions left unanswered and statements that are expanded upon, explored, and even disproved. The same can be said for history and the past tales. Whilst in the modern world we have concise knowledge of dates and times, in the past, before records were kept track of religiously, there was a flexibility to this knowledge, or in some cases, no knowledge at all. Women and commoners were seen as less, or as less important than males and royalty. Records were kept for some and not for others, or documentation is lost to time. The introductions of the calendars such as the Gregorian calendar helped with marking the passage of time and special dates to remember, such as birth date and death dates. However, they were not marked or celebrated as they are today, especially birthdays. This means that for many fascinating individuals, there are unanswered questions. Women in the Tudor court were seen as less important than males. As such, they were not always recorded down, whilst a male stillborn or male child that died in its infancy, which is the first 7 years of its life, may have been recorded. The same for a female is more likely to have been overlooked. This means that when we come to some fascinating individuals such as the princesses of Elizabeth of York and Henry VII, who died young, or noble women who rose to power like Lady Jane Grey or Catherine Howard, we are left scratching our heads on the exact ages. For their birth dates were not deemed important to record, and so we can only speculate. The same comes for the Tudor woman some say is one of the most fascinating of all, Anne Boleyn. Whilst her month and date will likely never be known, historians have debated over the year of her birth for many a decade, even centuries in fact. And whilst a year or two out, inaccuracies are understandable and usually up for debate, the same cannot be said for the year difference of Anne, for the dates of her birth are debated between 1501 and 1507. Why a 6-year leeway? In this video, we shall be taking a look. When Anne was born, her parents would never have suspected that she would one day become queen. Queens were usually born, not made. Birth dates amongst the gentry and aristocracy were rarely recorded, perhaps jotted down in the front of a family Bible, or approximately remembered for the purpose of later inheritance and coming of age. They were recalled vaguely, often in relation to a particular calendar day, or disputed among witnesses who might date an arrival to after the Michaelmas fair or before the Feast of St. John. Birthdays were not so specific, nor were they celebrated in the same way as they are today. It would not be until after Anne's death that the parish registers across the land began to list the exact day of a baptism, marriage, or burial taking place, leaving historians to estimate the day of a child's arrival by a few days beforehand. By Amy License, Anne Boleyn, Adultery, Heresy, Desire. So, how did we come across these 2 years, and why are they disputed? Well, this is down to the many facts and aspects of Anne's life, along with sources throughout time. The dates all start to come into works when the first historian wrote about Anne's life during the era of Queen Elizabeth I. The first record of Anne's birth was written in Roman numerals by the Elizabethan antiquarian named William Camden. For any who do not know what an antiquarian is, they are an individual who studies antiquities and is interested in the history or past of an object, whether that be an artifact or a book. They do fall under the brackets of what we would classify as a historian in the past, as what we would call a modern day historian or archaeologist didn't really exist in the same way as today in the Tudor times. Antiquarians during the Tudor times quite often wrote books containing the facts we now use to incorporate history and historical events. William Camden wrote Anne's birth in Roman numerals in his book Annales Rerum Anglicarum et Hibernicarum Elizabetha, or, to translate, Annals of the English and Irish Affairs of Elizabeth. In other words, a concise year-by-year record of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, and so likely making markers of her parents. Camden himself wasn't born until 1551, long after Anne's death. And so, although contemporary, he had to rely on another original source. He did this with the personal records of one William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who was born in 1520. If the name Cecil rings any bells, well, this is because William Cecil was the chief advisor for Queen Elizabeth I for most of her reign. He is an interesting character we will look at a different time. William Cecil, having been born in 1520, he would have been a mid-teen during Anne's reign and death, and as mentioned previously, he was close to people who would likely know the truth of the question. Camden was writing this book on Cecil's instigation. The dilemma around this, though, comes in the fact that Cecil died in 1598, and Camden's first volume was not published until 1615. So there is some time between, and although his information is suggestive, it is not watertight. We do know that Camden was working with Cecil's blessings, but not his guidance, and he was likely working with papers supplied to him by the statesman, which is where the debate would begin. As anyone who has looked at an old document, whether for research or personal use, can tell you, the handwriting of an individual can change. It depends on many factors, from the tools used, age, skill set, and lettering type. Heck, handwriting of an individual changes even today. And in an era where calligraphy, like lettering, was the common norm, it left room for a wide variation of spelling. There is evidence in other documentation of Cecil's that the slanting and looping of letters can be misinterpreted, including numbers. One such example is a letter where you can easily mistake the 1 for a 7, if not for the fact the date being written is 1584, and so is unlikely to be 7584. So, we have one source that could have answered all of our questions, with both how contemporary it is and how close the main individual who is providing us with the evidence is close to the daughter of the woman in question. Yet there is potential questioning on its integrity due to penmanship. With that in mind, do we have any other near contemporary sources? Well, we do have a second one, yet this one has problems as well. The Catholic chaplain Henry Clifford is supposed to have wrote his account from a mixture of contemporary sources as well as using Camden's work. He was writing in 1610, though how he had access to an unpublished manuscript is anyone's guess and may give grounds to an argument that there was an earlier version published that has been lost to time. Henry Clifford also writes that Anne was born in 1507. He draws his main source from a woman named Jane Dormer, who was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Mary I. However, Jane, much like Camden and Clifford, are all born after Anne was alive, Jane being born in 1538, 2 years after Anne's death. Although there is argument that Jane could have asked her mistress for this information. However, excluding the fact that it corroborates with Camden, Clifford is not seen to be a very reliable source in this argument, for the simple reason of him being known for getting dates wrong. Clifford is famously known in his document to criticise Camden on supposedly concealing the true marriage date of Anne and Henry, due to the fact that Elizabeth is born so close after this. However, he then himself goes and mistakenly writes the wrong date for Anne's execution, getting it wrong by 5 whole days, when this evidence is easily accessible. This reduces his credibility on whether he is truthful in the debate of 1507. So we have learnt that the original source marks Anne's birth year as 1507, and as such many historians through the centuries corroborate that date. So where does the challenge of 1501 come in, and what evidence do we have to put it in contention with the original and contemporary source of 1507? Well, the argument for 1501 starts when you look into the people who Anne knew throughout her life, such as her father and the Elizabethan Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker. We will start with the evidence Matthew Parker provides to corroborate Anne being born in 1501 first. Matthew was a man who had dealings with Anne, becoming her chaplain while she was queen, when her previous chaplain, Thomas Cranmer, was risen to Archbishop of Canterbury. It is famously noted that during her arrest, before she was escorted to the Tower, Anne gave Matthew her daughter Elizabeth's spiritual well-being into safekeeping, something that Matthew seems to have taken to heart in his dealings with Elizabeth for the rest of his life. So it is to say that Parker, much like Cranmer, had a soft spot for Anne. When describing Anne, Matthew Parker is said to have called her his fellow countrywoman. And whilst they are both English, this reference is less talking about the country of England as a whole and more about the counties that make up England. To this day, England is still divided on the map into regions and then counties, each with their own accents and subcultures, some having become famous like the Essex accent or the Cornish pastries, whilst others not. With this in mind, and with the added unlikelihood of Parker being mistaken, for Anne and Matthew to be fellow countrymen would mean that Anne had to have been born in Norfolk, as Matthew himself was born in Norfolk in 1504. Anne was likely born in the family residence, which at the time in Norfolk would have been Blickling Hall. But is it unlikely that she would have been born there in 1507? Well, this is where her father steps in. Due to his courtly life before Anne entered the court, we know a fair bit about her father, and what he was up to through the years. This includes when he became a wealthy man. Thomas Boleyn lived with his wife in Blickling Hall, Norfolk, the generational family home, until his own father, Anne's grandfather, Sir William Boleyn, died in 1505. In doing so, he made Thomas a wealthy man, and one of the items he inherited was the now Boleyn infamous estate of Hever Castle in Kent. The location being closer to London, it would come at no surprise that Thomas moved his family to that location as their new family home in early 1506. For Anne to be a fellow countrywoman of Matthew Parker, she would have most likely had to have been born before the move in February 1506. Although Blickling Hall was still a residence of the family, so there is a bit of wiggle room for 1507. The other main evidence we have from Thomas Boleyn is from a letter he sent to Thomas Cromwell in July 1536. In this letter, he is seen to recalling his wife and how she brought him a child every year, stretching their annual allowance of £50 to its limit. This allowance was only in effect until Thomas inherited at the death of his father, so would have ended in 1505. For Anne's mother Elizabeth to have her childbearing years sitting between her marriage in 1499 and 1505, when her father-in-law died, would have led her to have 5 children, with only 3 of them entering adulthood. Now, although there is grounds that Elizabeth Boleyn could have had further pregnancies and miscarriages, we do have evidence that she had 5 children, 2 girls and 3 boys. 5 children for 5 years. Fitting Anne's father's comment would be the births of Mary, Anne and George, along with the 2 boys, Thomas and Henry, who died in infancy, and who we do have memorials of in both Penshurst Church and Hever Castle. Although there can be the argument that there were other children, or that it doesn't confirm that Anne was born in 1501, and whilst this is true, the circumstantial corroborating evidence does lean more to the earlier date of 1501 than the latter date of 1507. There is other evidence that can be put into play for both of the dates, and that is to do with Anne's formative learning years. Anne was given the opportunity to join the court of Margaret of Austria in 1517 to learn as a member of her household. We do have some surviving letters from this period of Anne corresponding with her father. It is evidence from these years that have been used in both sets of arguments, from her being referred to as La Petite Boleyn, translated to Little Boleyn, to her intelligence in how she writes and handles herself in her letters. These sources can be argued to both parties and is more of a debate on the differences between girl and woman, maturity and the comparative youth and naivety that in our modern world we would expect, which in some ways is the issue of using the evidence of her learning as grounds for the date she was born, as the world of the Tudors was very different to the modern world we see around us. It was harsher for even youths, and with the life expectancy being so much shorter than our world, there was not much room for the joys of youth that we nowadays long for in adulthood and thrive in as children. So, the debate remains divided, and is likely to remain so until new evidence comes to light. Evidence that should give us a closer answer, if there is any. In the past hundreds of years, people have leaned more to the date of 1507. However, in modern times, the consensus sits more with 1501. Although there is a fair amount of historians who sit on either side of the table and are unsure. Which do you think? Thank you for watching this episode of Days of Yore and Lore. To support this channel, please share it with anyone else you think would enjoy these videos. Like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments down below of any subject you would like me to look into, and I will see you all in the next video.